transport, tourism and sport, social protection and defence. He became Taoiseach in 2017, and to paraphrase one of the newspapers at the time, must have been a very proud mother and father who had the opportunity to say, "My son, the doctor, has become the Taoiseach." He served in that capacity until 2020 and is now Tánaiste and Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. The Tánaiste will be speaking with as much latitude as he likes on the topics of low pay, on how to prevent a growth in inequality during the COVID response, and on how does, and I hope he doesn't mind the categorization, the centre-right of Irish politics prepare itself to deal with social inequality. Given the numbers registered, we have to do this session as a webinar, so the audience cannot interact directly with the Tánaiste, but you can put questions, and I hope you will put questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and then we will try to get to as many of those as possible. As a courtesy to the Tánaiste, we'd hope that the questions you ask will address the topics of the day. And as a courtesy to all of you, we will aim to finish within the allotted time of about 1 hour, so by 12, hopefully. So Tánaiste, I'll leave it to you to start with your slides. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks, Kevin. And first of all, good morning, everyone. And at the outset, thanks very much for asking me to participate in this series, and had a bit of fun over the weekend putting together my presentation and thinking about what I was going to say. I know a lot of my opponents like to characterize me as being of no substance and being all spin. I think probably all politicians engage in a degree of spin. It's part of what we have to do in our job. But when I'm not spinning, I'm also a policy wonk. And I love policy, I love information, I love data. And that's one of the reasons why I'd always pay attention to the kind of work that TASC does, because even though it comes from the centre left of the spectrum, it's associated with unions, which is fine, but is not my political tradition. I do think the work that you produce is valuable. It genuinely is evidence-based. It genuinely does make a contribution towards policy debates, and serious stuff. It's not out to get anyone, it's out to try and build a better society, and that's why I really do value the work that you do, and I'm always interested to see the publications that you produce, and it does affect my own thinking, and it is recognised and watched in government. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. So I've been asked to speak really about three things, so I'm going to stick to those three things. The first is low pay. The second is the unequal COVID pandemic. And then thirdly, how does the centre-right respond to inequality? So I'll deal with the first one first. The first issue is low pay. And the question that I'd ask at the outset, is Ireland really a low pay economy? And so often the case when it comes to things like this, it depends on how you measure it. I think if you measure it in cash terms, we are definitely not a low pay economy. Our minimum wage is higher than the vast majority of countries' minimum wage. If you compare the salary of a teacher here to a teacher in Britain or across Europe, a doctor here to a doctor around the world, a cleaner, somebody working in a restaurant, pretty much any analogue, if you compare what somebody is paid in Ireland versus what they're paid in the rest of the world, we're actually a high pay economy and pay very well. There'd be very few that pay better. Perhaps Luxembourg, some of the Nordics, some phenomenally wealthy countries with oil wealth, for example, like Norway and some in the Middle East. But generally speaking, we are a high pay economy. And that is very much true if you compare like with like, same job with same job across the world. When you adjust for purchasing power parity, it's a little bit different because the cost of living in Ireland is higher and people pay for public services that you would not have to pay for in other countries, but still not a low pay economy. You can make a case that we're a low pay economy, but that's largely based on relativities, largely based on the fact that there are a disproportionate number of people in Ireland who are on very high pay. And that is largely linked to the fact that we have some very well paid professions, not that many people in them, but they are very well paid. And also we have the multinationals and they operate in a particular labour market and they pay their staff very well. And you could actually bring about greater equality in Ireland if you were to expel the multinationals, and with them go the jobs, with them go all the tax revenues, and more so than ever, we need those tax revenues from those big companies. And that, I suppose, is what people would describe as, equality downwards, rather than that the poor were poorer so long as the rich were less rich. And that's not my view of the world. But you could make a case for us being a low pay economy on that basis using relativities. But I think when you compare like with like, the same job with the same job, we're a high pay economy, but also an expensive country in which to live. So having said that, and I'm sure people will challenge that, I'd say something that I think we can all agree on, and that is, does it really matter? Are there people on low pay in Ireland? Yes, there are. There are hundreds of thousands of people in Ireland who work very hard, who do difficult jobs, and don't get paid very well for it. And that's not a good thing. And I think we need to change that, and we want to change it. Low pay is not just difficult for the person who's on low pay, because it's hard for them to live a good life, impossible to save for a pension, impossible to put together precautionary savings, extremely hard at the moment to ever buy their own home. So even if, whether it's 1 million people or 500,000 people isn't the point, whether it's however many people there are lots of people working full time. Low pay is that their income is the main income in the house, or there may be 2 low paid incomes in the house, and they can't afford to live well. So low pay is undesirable for society, no matter how many people suffer from it. I think low pay is also expensive for government. I've seen that so many times in the different jobs I've done as a minister. The government often picks up the bill for low pay, whether it's the family income supplement, working family payment, whether it is the cost of medical cards, the cost of housing subsidies. When people are poorly paid, very often the bill is picked up by government. And if it would be better if people were paid better, and that would cost society and cost government less. But competitiveness does count, and I interact with businesses all the time, particularly small businesses, family-run businesses, those who have to operate along the border and compete with companies in Northern Ireland, and we can't discount that. We've managed to increase pay considerably in the last couple of years, minimum wage and pay in general, without a negative impact on employment. So I don't accept that higher pay means fewer jobs, but there is a limit to that, and there is a point where you could actually increase pay in certain sectors and in certain businesses to the point where people end up working fewer hours, they have their hours cut, or there are fewer jobs. So, we have to be mindful of that. And certainly the Low Pay Commission would indicate some evidence, not very strong evidence, but some evidence that recent increases in the minimum wage have resulted in people being asked to work fewer hours. So maybe getting paid more per hour, but less overall. And that's something we need to bear in mind. But if we all agree that low pay is something that's expensive for government and bad for people and undesirable for society, I suppose the question is, what can we do about it? Before I go to that, though, I'll just show you that graph that shows where we're going already. That's from the CSO, shows average annual hourly earnings. As you can see, they've increased considerably since 2013 over the past 7 or 8 years, and the rate of increase is increasing. Hit badly, I'd say, by the pandemic. We don't have those figures yet, but nobody can doubt that wages in Ireland have been increasing, and they've been increasing faster than the rate of inflation, and that is significant. That's the minimum wage. As you can see, minimum wage increasing. Not that many people in Ireland on the minimum wage, by the way, and the numbers on the minimum wage is falling all the time, but the minimum wage does set a floor, and lots of people are paid just above it. So when we increase the minimum wage, it has the positive effect of increasing wages for other people who are earning just above the minimum wage. But you see there 7 years in a row of increases in the minimum wage under Fine Gael Labour government, under the Fine Gael independent government, and now Fine Gael Fianna Fáil Green government, always staying ahead of the rate of inflation, generally staying ahead of earnings growth. And even in 2021, where there's a very small increase of 10 cents, And by the way, if the Low Pay Commission had recommended 20, I would have been happy to accept that. We've always accepted their recommendations, whether it was 10 cents or 60. I expect even in 2021, that 10 cents increase, while very small, while only 1%, will probably be ahead of earnings across the economy, which will probably fall, in 2020 or 2021 because of the pandemic. When it comes to national minimum wage, as you'll know, we have the fourth highest national minimum wage in the world, which is a good thing. But when you adjust it for purchasing power parity, we're about seventh, and we're actually behind the UK when you adjust for purchasing power parity. And when you think of it that way, it's not so good. You know, we like to kind of see ourselves as a Northern European country, and we like to see ourselves on pretty much everything as being a little bit better than the United Kingdom. And us falling behind them in terms of purchasing power parity is a matter of concern, and would suggest to me that our minimum wage is now too low. And that's before, of course, you factor in things like the cost of living. Overall, the cost of living in the UK is higher, heavily distorted by London. But again, lots of things in the UK you don't have to pay for that you have to pay for in Ireland, particularly in relation to healthcare. So how can we make it better? I had a look at the paper the TASC produced on this, the state we're in, on low pay. So this isn't all your ideas, it's kind of a mix of your ideas and mine. And this is where I think we can make a difference next year, the year after, and over the course of this government, if not longer. The first and I think the most significant thing is that move to a living wage. It's in the programme for government. I'm the minister tasked with doing it, and I intend to do it. I would like us to be in a position whereby the next time the Low Pay Commission makes a recommendation, probably sometime this year, or sometime around this time next year rather, it's going to be one that is for the phasing in of a living wage. And under legislation, I can make a direction to the Low Pay Commission to do exactly that. I'm kind of working on the details around that at the moment. I'm going to meet them this week actually to talk it through with them. And of course, what it really boils down to, though, when it comes to a living wage, is the detail. The difference between a living wage and a minimum wage is, of course, that a living wage is linked to earnings, essentially. It can either be a basket of sort of minimum essential services and products that anyone should be able to buy if they're on a living wage, or you can link it to a percentage of general earnings. There are different models. There's the UK model, which I wouldn't like to adopt here. There's the model that is done by the Living Wage Task Force, led in many ways by the Vincentian Partnership for Justice, which has a particular model, but again, is one that's imperfect, doesn't include the voice of the employer, makes assumptions about housing costs that aren't actually correct. So we'll need to come up with our own model for calculating the living wage. But the bottom line is it'll be a living wage that is substantially higher than the current national minimum wage. So will need to be phased in order to assist business to meet the cost, and it will need some rules around it, particularly around what age it kicks in and so on, because there is a difference between people who are doing a student job and those who actually are having to pay rent and having to get a mortgage. And that's not to say that there aren't students who have to pay rent, but you get the kind of policy questions that we're going to have to figure out. But that's something that I really want to make the job of the Low Pay Commission over the course of 2021, with a view to phasing in a living wage from 2022 onwards. The second area where I think we can make a difference is with the next public sector pay deal. This is not within my remit. That the talks are going to be led, of course, by Minister McGrath, and I'll be very much guided by his views on this. But I know some people on the call will be involved in trade unions, and I do think you've a crucial role to play in this as to what that public sector pay deal looks like. I think there's a general appreciation from everyone that because of the level of borrowing that the government is incurring this year and next, the capacity for significant public sector pay increases it just isn't there. But that isn't to say that we should do nothing. And I think if we're doing anything, and particularly if unions are making their pitch to government, I don't think the best thing to do is across the board increases of 1% or 2% or whatever, because inevitably 1% and 2% increases don't make a huge difference in people's lives. Those who are the best off get the most in cash terms anyway. It really does nothing to reduce inequality or to deal with low pay. So perhaps if we're doing anything in the next public sector pay deal, the focus should be on the lowest paid, on increases for those who work in the public service who are on low pay, and there are lots of them. Lots of ways to do that. You can do flat cash amount increases. You'll all know this better than me, but that could be done. And perhaps a focus then on the outstanding issue, the kind of running sore of the recent entrants. People who joined the public service from 2012 onwards, not necessarily all in bad pay by any means. Teachers, for example, are very well paid in Ireland, very high starting salary. Same would apply to other areas too, but something that is unfair and was never supposed to last forever. And we have an agreement to close that gap between now and 2026, but perhaps that could be done a little bit quicker. The third area where I think we can make a real difference is on improving the benefits that people receive for paying PRSI. The social insurance-based benefits, something I really like. It's very much based on the contributory principle. In my time as social protection minister, I was able to make a good start on this, extending treatment benefits, bringing in job seekers benefit for the self-employed, invalidity pension, brought in paternity benefit. Virginia Doherty succeeded me bringing in paternal leave and paternal benefit. A lot more we can do in that space. And I think sick pay, which I intend to legislate for by the middle of next year, is part of that too, because some of it will be linked to what we do in illness benefit. Other areas where we can take action, the cost of public services. Ireland is an anomaly in that so many people have to pay hospital charges, so many people have to pay to see their GP. People still have to pay up to €100 a month per household for their medicines. Doesn't have to be that way. And we're pouring billions and billions into health. Maybe we should set aside a couple of $100 million a year to reduce some of those out-of-pocket costs for people. It's hard to believe it, but people earning the minimum wage in Ireland don't always qualify for a medical card. And those things should change and can change. The other area around that where we're a real outlier, in my view, is the cost of childcare. Government puts huge money now into childcare. If you take all the different schemes together, the National Childcare Scheme, ECHE, the Employment Wage Subsidy, probably paying 70% of the cost of childcare now. And yet parents still pay very high fees, and there's something fundamentally wrong there that I think this government has to get right. The next area is sectoral bargaining. Won't say too much about that, but there is a Supreme Court case that we might get a judgment from in February, and that'll give us an indication as to where we can go with that, as to whether we can have more of it, or whether we're going to need to go back to the drawing board in terms of representation. Areas where I think we've had a real difficulty and haven't done well in the last couple of years, and I say that as somebody who was in government for the last couple of years, is housing costs and rent, and how that has eroded the real gains for a lot of people. People renting have seen all those gains that I'm talking about eaten up due to the cost of rent and the cost of housing, and I hope this will be the government that turns that around. One area that's in your own report is reducing executive compensation, and I won't surprise you to hear that I actually don't think that's a road we should go down. We operate in a very competitive labour market, an English-speaking international labour market. If we pay and tax people who work in the multinationals and those big companies more, if we pay them less and tax them more, we will get less investment. And the same thing applies in the public service. In a theoretical world, you would say Irish hospital consultants are paid too much. They're paid 3 times as much as they are in Denmark, more than they're paid in the UK. That's not the real world. We're competing with Australia, the US and Canada for consultants, and they'll leave. And we will have an inferior health service if we don't recognise the reality of that for so long as Australia and Canada and the US can poach our talent, for so long as Israel and Netherlands can home our multinationals, we need to be competitive and provide good pay in those areas. Just on the whole issue of COVID, COVID is an agent for inequality. COVID itself doesn't cause inequality, but it has exposed some of the underlying inequality that exists in our society. If you look at the health impact, it's disproportionately affected the old. Across the world, it's disproportionately affected men. And also, interestingly, certainly in the first wave, although not the second wave, disproportionately affected affluent households. So the health impact in terms of deaths and illnesses is on older people, better off people, and men more so than women. But the economic impact is actually the reverse. Those who've lost their jobs, those whose incomes have been hammered, young, private sector, self-employed, migrants, low paid, and that is really evident and really has exposed a lot of the flaws in the way our society and the way our economy is structured. We knew they were there already, but it's really exposed them for all to see. And I think that's significant because it's caused a change of heart for a lot of people. It means that COVID can be an agent for positive political change, because I think those of us who in the past, saw the frontline worker, the essential worker, as the Garda or the nurse or the fireman or the doctor, all in well-paid, secure jobs, now see things differently. The frontline essential workers also include the carers and the cleaners and the shop workers and the people who do deliveries, and we need to do better by them. And that has to be, I think, one of the positive things that arises from the post-pandemic environment. Just running through that's employment data. You can see how on the big graph how employment has fallen, but maybe not as much as we may think. So I think it's recoverable. But what you see there in the smaller graph, the pink graph, how Ireland compares relative to other countries. With the exception of Spain, people in Ireland were much more likely to lose their jobs than in other countries. That's because employment is less secure in Ireland than other countries. And those most likely to lose their jobs were the lowest paid. And we all know that, but it's really stark when you look at that graph. Because I'm running out of time, I won't run through this, but what can we do to build a more secure society and economy post-pandemic? Low pay, touched on that already. Sick pay, touched on that already. A more modern European social insurance system. The reason why we introduced the pandemic unemployment payment, and I was there with Pascal and Regina the day we did it, it was because we couldn't bear the idea that hundreds of thousands of people would suddenly have to get by on €203 a week. That was always true and is still a problem. And I think that at least for the first couple of weeks or months when somebody loses their job, they should receive an income-linked payment, like the pandemic unemployment payment. And when that is phased out, it shouldn't be back to the old normal. We should bring in something new. That's going to cost, by the way, and we need to have a grown-up conversation about increased employees and employers PRSI to fund some of those changes. Auto-enrollment, again, a huge inequality between the public and private sector. Most people in the private sector not having access to a pension. Need to get that started. Cost of healthcare I've touched on earlier. Housing security, remote working. An area that I think is going to be really important is lifelong education and the right to a second chance education for those who didn't get that chance, particularly now as more and more jobs will become obsolete in the next couple of years because of technology. And the 10th area is representation. Again, we need to have a grown-up conversation about how we can allow people to be properly represented in their workplace. To wrap up, the ideological question I was asked, which I'm happy to answer, how does the centre-right address inequality? And I'm very happy to be described as centre-right. Ireland is one of those weird countries in which people think left means you care about people and right means you don't. That isn't true and was never true. Most people in Ireland describe themselves these days as centre-left, but actually probably think centre-right when you drill down into what these things actually mean. I think all of us appreciate that left and right is far too simplistic, and it's a spectrum anyway, and of course it's not a linear one. You could be left wing on economic views and right wing on social views, so it's a very crude way to describe ideology, but it does exist and it is there. As somebody who would consider myself as centre right, I'm probably closer to Blair than Thatcher. But there are people who would be Corbynites and Benites who would say Blair and Thatcher were just the same anyway. So it all depends on how you look at these things. But I do think if there's a fundamental difference, and I do see it in practical politics, the fundamental difference between people who are centre-right and those who are centre-left and left does go back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, where Adam Smith says that wealth has to be created before it can be distributed. And I believe that is true. And it doesn't just have to be created once, it has to be created continuously every year. Unless you're oil rich or diamond rich or gold rich, a country needs to earn its wealth every year. And only when wealth is earned can it be distributed. And it should be distributed, by the way, redistributed, but it has to be earned first. And I almost never see politicians from the left or centre left ever recognizing that or appreciating that or giving more than 10% of their time to thinking about how to create wealth. It's all about distribution. So I think people on the left tend to think there's a cake and it's all about cutting it up more fairly. People on the centre right understand that somebody has to bake that cake and bake it every year, or there isn't anything to redistribute. And I think that's the fundamental difference. And just go through their speeches. It's once a year you'll find a centre left or left wing politician talking about wealth creation. What makes people centre right? I think it's a commitment to the social market economy. This is thinking that goes back to the Christian Democrats of the 50s, the view that the market economy is the best way to create wealth, but that's about all it's good at. That's the state needs to come in to make sure that there are protections for people, a floor below which nobody falls, and redistribution. But the market economy is the best way to create wealth, and the government tries to build a social market economy out of that. I think a lot of social democrats believe that too, but certainly would not be the view of the more radical left, who would support a centrally managed and controlled economy where the government owns the commanding heights of the economy and the means of production and supply and all of that. The second area, what makes you centre right? Personal freedom, belief in freedom of the individual. There are lots of people on the centre right who are socially conservative, but I'm from the libertarian, more liberal side of things and believe in personal freedom, people's right to make decisions for themselves, choices around their own bodies and the way they live their lives. I think another thing that defines the centre right is a commitment to globalism and multilateralism. My party is the party that brought us into the United Nations. My party has always supported European integration, whether it was joining the EEC or the Euro, whether it was the single market, Maastricht, Lisbon, support security cooperation through PESCO, for example, supports free trade agreements. That is not the case on the left. Greens and Sinn Féin are relatively recent supporters of European integration. Labour initially opposed it, but came on board decades ago. And again, when you see votes in the Dáil, it's the left that are voting against PESCO. When we bring the free trade agreement on Canada, it'll be left-wing parties that vote against it. And if you're not in favour with free trade with Canada, I can't imagine who you would want free trade with. It really is one of the nicest, most European countries in the world. I can't imagine how you'd be in favour of a trade deal with Britain if you can't vote for a trade deal with Canada. And you'll see the left being the ones who oppose this consistently. And then finally is the issue of equality of opportunity, as opposed to necessarily equality of outcome. So about to finish, that's how have we done in recent years in terms of actually bringing about equality. Not as well as we would like, but maybe not so bad. Certainly in the 3 years in which I had the honour to be Taoiseach, we saw poverty rates consistently fall. We saw deprivation rates consistently fall, and those at risk of poverty consistently fall. And what's as important as the bars going down is the lines going up, because that was achieved at a time when the floor was actually rising. So this is based on relativities, and with a rising floor, the poverty line, if you like, was going up, and yet fewer people were below it. And that's something that I'd hope we can continue in the next couple of years, whatever aberration may occur as a result of the pandemic. That's Ireland at risk of poverty, doing pretty well. Countries doing better than us there, pretty much just Finland, maybe Denmark. Pretty much better than everyone else in Western Europe, better than Sweden, Austria, Germany, Denmark. Not something people often accept or fully appreciate, but it is true, and we can do better still. And this is a country that's never had a left-led government, and a country that has had Fine Gael in office for the past 9 years. I doubt there's any left-wing party in Ireland or left-wing government in Europe that can compete with that, which I think is, again, something we don't get enough credit for. And then finally, using the Gini coefficient to different measure, if you prefer it, how we've managed to decrease income inequality really consistently over the past 14 years. One of the few countries in Europe that actually hasn't seen an increase in income inequality, at least in recent years. So final slide. How does the centre-right address inequality? First of all, recognise that wealth has to be created. You have to be creating jobs, supporting enterprise, believing in the economy, and wealth needs to be created. Stable public finances and politics, I think, is crucial. Higher pay, which we've touched on earlier, higher pay for everyone, but particularly those on low pay. Better welfare. Our social transfers make a huge difference in Ireland. If it were not for our social transfers, we would have much higher poverty rates. So we need to continue to improve our welfare system, ideally index it to earnings. So I'd like to do that. Not sure we can afford to, but I think we should. The area that we have fallen down on badly, and I accept this, is housing. We need to do much better on that. Build housing of all types, social housing, housing to rent, cost rental, all of these things over the next couple of years, and then do a bit better on access to affordable public services, with a particular emphasis, I think, on reducing out-of-pocket expenses for healthcare and childcare. And that's how the centre-right can bring about a more prosperous and more equal society. So thanks, Emil. Sorry if that was a bit long.
Oh, Dan, that's great and very interesting, Tánaiste. Thank you. Can I just ask a couple of questions? First of all, okay, so based on your sort of analysis of the centre-right and your picture of how that approach to politics can create a better country, it's certainly the case, I think, that we have much more income and more wealth to share. But we also have a fairly stubborn class system, not a UK type class system, but nonetheless, there's a lot of people whose families have been at the less well-off end of the spectrum, and those families tend to stick there. And there is a sense in which in all the Western countries that inequality is rising. In Ireland, income inequality is not, but that's happened mostly because we've protected people by a progressive tax system and by reasonably positive social welfare transfers compared to others. But we haven't got to the point where those people can say, well, you know, I really think my children's, the next generation and the generation after that will be better socially placed than the current generation. And maybe in that area, we're not doing as well as we think. How do we address real equality of opportunity, not just a sort of a equality under the law?
Yeah, well, I think that thesis is correct. Economic inequality is ingrained, and it's intergenerational, and that's not just true in Ireland. That's true across the world. So how do you make that better? I think you do try to raise the floor for everyone, and that's what we've talked about already in terms of low pay and access to public services. That raises the floor for everyone, but particularly for those on low pay, because we'll always need people working in what we describe as low skill jobs. So we need to make sure that those people are better off, and that we don't rely exclusively on migrant labor, that these are good jobs and people can have good careers in what we traditionally describe as low skill jobs. And the second area really is education, I think. And one thing where I'd like to include in the National Economic Plan when it's done is a meaningful right to second chance education for people who didn't have that chance when they were younger, for whatever reasons, because they had to go out and contribute to the household income when they were in their late teens and early 20s, when people from middle class families were supported by their parents not to earn a bean until they were 23 or 24. So I think they're the things that can make the most difference, but I don't have a monopoly on wisdom on that. So I haven't seen a task paper on intergenerational inequality, so I'd like to see one if there is one.
There probably should be one. But most of our educational spending is evenly distributed to capitation fees and the like. It still leaves the better off neighborhoods, let's say, with better schools, because there's more capacity for donations and and so forth. Should we really be targeting educational opportunity and doing that with our purses as well as with simply an equal share of current funds?
I think we have good programs, you know, like TASC, for example, in education is a classic example of, you know, more funding and smaller classes for schools in disadvantaged areas. The outcomes of that are unclear, to be honest, but a lot of resources put into that. And I think probably another area is around early education. And we do now have those 2 years of ECHE, which are important, because I think the best investments are probably in the earlier years. So I think it's probably more in the space of childcare and early education, and more resources and more that we can do at primary and secondary level. But again, the easy part when you have the money is to put the money in. Actually producing outcomes is a different thing. And I think that's harder to achieve.
One of our questions is about, a couple of our questions from the audience are about tax systems, local and property taxes and so forth. We're certainly now a high income country. I'm not sure that we've had enough decades of high income to be a very wealthy country, but there are huge wealth disparities within our country. And one possibility that people talk about is to tax wealth as well as income, and to use that to redistribute not just income but wealth. Is there a centre-right approach to that might be effective?
Yeah, well, I suppose we're new money, aren't we? Yeah. We're kind of nouveau riche. We've a high income, but we've only been wealthy for 20 or 30 years, and that's reflected in our infrastructure. If we had been wealthy for a long time, we'd have a metro systems, and we'd have much better infrastructure than we have now. And that's why I think we need to invest in capital. And one thing I'm really happy the government has done, unlike the last recession, is we haven't cut capital. It'll be 10 billion next year, and we're going to build that infrastructure that a wealthy country needs and should have, economic and social infrastructure. You know, we've hospitals that are 200 and 300 years old. I don't need to tell you all that. So capital investment is going to be important for lots of positive reasons. I think we do have a lot of taxes on wealth already. You know, income tax is highly progressive. We've capital gains tax. We've capital acquisitions tax. We have a property tax. So we do have taxes on wealth, almost all forms of wealth. And I'm not against property taxes. I voted for them. A lot of people on the left didn't. I did vote for their introduction, and even my group on Fingal County Council is one of the few groups that didn't vote for the cut. I won't go into that because Fine Gael has a mixed record in that one, so I'll skip that one. But at least in my own area, we didn't go for a cut in the local property tax. We decided to spend a bit more money in Fingal. The difficulty I think with wealth taxes is when they're introduced. And lots of examples in Ireland and around the world of wealth taxes is they didn't generate much revenue, and they're not much good to you. You know, if you're just doing it as a symbolic measure or a punitive measure, it's not much good to you. What you need is taxes that actually produce revenue, and that probably involves getting rid of more of the tax avoidance mechanisms. There's still too many ways in which wealthy people can avoid paying their fair share of tax. We've got rid of some of them. We need to get rid of more. And in terms of property taxes, you know, I think property taxes make sense. It's one of the forms of wealth and forms of assets that you can't move, that you can't hide and you can't offshore. It's politically very difficult, though, as you know. But I think they make sense. I don't want to give you a headline, but
no, I'm not asking for a headline.
If I was able to reduce taxes on income and increase them in property, that would make sense.
To avoid the headline effect, imagine Ireland of 30 years from now. What's our tax and our tax and income, our income and wealth tax system at that stage, and how does it help our less well off to elevate themselves over the course of that 30 years?
Yeah, well, first thing I'd hope in 20 or 30 years time that we'll still be able to be getting as much out of corporation profit tax as we do now. I know we've a low rate, but the amount of corporation profit tax divided by the number of people in the country in Ireland is extremely high, and there's a real vulnerability there, I think. So I'd hope that we'll continue to bring in the kind of money we're bringing in from corporation profit tax in the years ahead. I'd hope that we'd see lower income taxes. People on very modest, very average incomes pay a very high marginal rate of income tax, in my view. I'd hope that would change, and people on average and good incomes wouldn't have to pay the highest rate of income tax. And we would draw more then from, I suppose, taxes on things like carbon, taxes on property, and on other forms of wealth.
Well, the problem, of course, with the carbon tax is when you get to the point where no one is burning carbon, you won't have any tax.
True. We've yet to get to that point on either alcohol or tobacco, but yeah. Yeah, no, that is true. For a carbon tax to work, by definition, revenue should start falling in the next, at some point anyway.
We have a few questions from people about childcare, and so take that same 30-year perspective. How will childcare look, and how will it be paid for?
Well, I hope it won't be 30 years. I hope it'll be more like 5 or 10. I'd like childcare in 5 or 10 years to be seen as part of education as much as childcare. So it's education starting really at the age of 3, and that's kind of happening already. But I think we can step that up a bit more. I'd like to see it being well paid. It's a very low paid area now, and that's problematic for lots of different reasons. Especially given the level of qualification that those who work in it now have. So much better pay in that sector. And I'd like to see it predominantly state subsidized so that fees could be capped. And there are ways of doing that. If we could cap fees for childcare, something like €500 a month for a middle income family, that's as good as a tax cut, as good as a substantial tax cut. For a lot of middle income families and low income families, it's costing as much as the mortgage or the rent every month. And it's a huge disincentive for parents to go to work. And we already put a huge amount of state funding into childcare. And I'm just not convinced that we get the return from that we should. So I would see it as being predominantly state funded, maybe not state run, but predominantly state funded, maybe to the extent of 70%, higher pay, greater integration with education, and then parents paying fees that are income linked and capped.
And then if we talk a little bit
this will cost, but it'll be worth it.
As a former Department of Finance official, I'm glad you say that, because it has to be paid for. And that's why I asked the question about property taxes. Thinking again then in terms of the healthcare system and the ideal system of 20 or 30 years from now. The one thing about our non-universal system is that people who are better off are paying for healthcare. If we were to put resources, is it the case that if we were to put resources into a universal system, we would end up taking public resources and paying for people who are currently paying for their own healthcare? And would that reduce the amount of healthcare available for lower income groups, or can we design a true universal healthcare that gets a system that gets rid of the disparities in provision?
It's a tricky one. I read a good piece by Tony O'Brien the other day in Sunday Business Post, and what he said, he kind of spoke the truth. He said, Sláinte is a vision, but not a plan. And all parties do have a shared vision of universal healthcare, like every country in Europe has, centre right or centre left. Universal healthcare is the norm in Europe and the Western world, with the exception of the United States. And we have that shared vision. How you achieve it is actually very difficult. It's really a classic case for Ireland, that I wouldn't start from here, because we have such a messed up system. It is expensive. People pay a lot for healthcare in Ireland. The government puts a lot of money into healthcare, and there's an enormous misallocation of resources. I think Maurice Nelligan said it for me once he said public patients are undertreated and private patients are overtreated. So we have a huge amount of resources going into unnecessary investigations for private patients because those investigations and procedures generate income. And then a huge number of people who need procedures and investigations not getting them because they generate cost. So that's the kind of fundamental problem. I don't know if an NHS style system would work for Ireland, given where we're coming from. And I think the NHS is overrated. Their patient outcomes aren't great. They're inferior to Ireland in a lot of cases. You're much more likely to die of cancer, for example, in the NHS than you are in the HSE, or more likely anyway. So I don't think that's the model that would work in Ireland. Probably what might work best, and this is a personal opinion, not government policy or party policy, is some form of single payer system. A little bit more like what's in Germany or what's in France, where you can have private healthcare providers, you can have public healthcare providers, you can have voluntary healthcare providers, but there's a single payer or a de facto single payer social health insurance model that funds it. That's a longer discussion for another day.
Okay, maybe
you might do an NHS if you were setting it up from scratch, but we're not, and we need to find a way to bring in the private providers and voluntary providers.
Can I ask one final question, since we're talking about our 30-year perspective? There's a lot of new Irish people who arrived or whose families arrived in Ireland in the last 20 years only. And they don't have roots, and they don't typically have great wealth. The kind of roots that maybe supports a person through a difficult time. How do we address, and to what extent should we address, because not everyone thinks we should, the kind of inequalities that arise from that new group of people?
Yeah, well, it's a very diverse group of people, though. You know, bear in mind, and my own family story speaks to that. My dad's from India originally. When I grew up in Blanchardstown, I was the only kid in my class with dark skin and a funny name. That is not what Blanchardstown looks like now. It's a very different place. But you know, I was the doctor's kid, and that's different, of course, than coming in as an unskilled worker or perhaps as an asylum seeker. And migration in Ireland is really diverse. It's not like Germany, where you know, it was predominantly people from Turkey, or France, where it was predominantly people who came in from North America to fill skills gaps. And that's a good thing, I think. You know, when I knock on doors in the western end of my constituency around Hansfield and Ongar, and I knock on the door, every second person who's bought a new home is Indian or Pakistani or Chinese. You know, it's interesting to see that people coming from those Asian countries often have good jobs, work hard, save money, are the ones who are the new property owners in the western part of my constituency. That is not necessarily the case, of course, across the board. You know, there are lots of people coming in different scenarios. So I think one of the good things about the Irish immigration story is that it's not just one large group of people from one part of the world generally filling skills gaps in one part of the labour market. It is very diverse, and you see that in the multinationals too. You see it in healthcare. People from all over the world in good paid jobs. That doesn't answer your question, I'm afraid, but perhaps it's a reflection.
Tánaiste, thank you very much. We promised to wrap up around 12, and we'll do that. On behalf of TASC and our chair, Mike Jennings, our CEO, Shanna Cohen, who's sitting there as a black box on the screen, and the rest of the board and staff of TASC, we'd like to thank, first of all, you, the audience, for taking part, for sending us questions, a few of which we actually got to. I really appreciate those. And I hope you'll join us again for future parts of this series. Tánaiste, I'd like to thank you very much for giving us your time and your openness to sort of a wide-ranging discussion that maybe properly avoided today's political issues, so as to think a little bit more about the future. So that concludes our session for now. Please keep an eye on www.tasc.ie for upcoming events, and in particular our annual lecture on the 2nd of December with Philip Alston, the UN Rapporteur on extreme poverty. So a more international feel to that discussion. Tánaiste, thank you very much. Thank you all.